After 19 years apart, millionaire William Becker locks eyes with his ex-wife at a gala, only to find her surrounded by 4 young adults who look eerily familiar. But Charlotte was infertile, wasn't she? As he digs deeper, secrets unravel, and one truth changes everything. What happened during those missing years? The air inside the Grand Avalon Hotel was thick with expensive perfume, clinking champagne glasses, and the murmur of power conversations weaving through the opulent ballroom. William Becker moved through the crowd with the kind of presence that turned heads. Impeccably dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, his salt and pepper hair neatly styled, and a whiskey glass dangling effortlessly between his fingers. At 58, he was still the same dominant figure he had always been. A self-made millionaire, ruthless in business, charming when it suited him. He had mastered the art of appearing unbothered, untouchable, and yet, on nights like this, when the high society of New York gathered under a chandelier-lit ceiling, he felt the hollowness beneath it all. He barely listened as some hedge fund manager rattled on about market shifts and international ventures. His mind drifted, caught in that quiet space between success and solitude. He didn't believe in fate, never had. Life was a series of choices, calculated, precise, and if played right, victorious. And yet, in the split second it took for his eyes to scan the room, he felt his chest tighten. His fingers froze around his whiskey glass. Charlotte. She stood near the farthest bar, facing away from him, but there was no mistaking her. The curve of her shoulders, the way she tucked a loose strand of chestnut brown hair behind her ear, it sent a sharp pulse of familiarity through him, as if no time had passed at all. 19 years. He had not seen her, not even once, since the divorce. No accidental run-ins, no whispered rumors of where she had gone. It was as if she had vanished, and now, suddenly, she was here, occupying the same space as him. A slow inhale. He steadied himself, schooling his expression into neutrality as he took a deliberate step forward. But then, just as he was about to call her name, he noticed them. 4 young adults stood around her. The conversation in the room dulled to a distant hum as William's focus zeroed in on the group. 2 young men and 2 young women, all in their late teens or early 20s, casually positioned near Charlotte as if they belonged there. Their presence was striking, not because they were loud or particularly attention-grabbing, but because something about them made William's stomach twist in a way he couldn't quite explain. The eldest, a young man with dark hair and sharp features, held himself with quiet confidence, his eyes scanning the crowd as if he were accustomed to measuring people before engaging. The second, a few years younger, had a leaner frame, a touch more relaxed but with an undeniable intensity in his gaze. The 2 young women mirrored the contrast. The first had a delicate grace, observant but reserved, while the other stood with a silent defiance, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. William's breath shallowed as his mind tried to make sense of it. There was something eerily, undeniably familiar about them. Their features, the shape of their faces, the sharpness of their gazes. It was like looking into a past he had never lived but should have. It was impossible. Charlotte had been infertile. They had tried. They had endured the brutal reality of failed treatments, of false hopes, of silent, aching nights that had ultimately torn them apart. He had walked away from that pain, buried it, told himself that it was better that way. And yet here she was, with them. His grip tightened on the glass before he forced himself to relax. He had to approach this carefully. If he confronted her in front of everyone, it would make a scene. He had built an empire on control, and now was not the time to let emotions dictate his actions. William made his way toward the bar, careful, slow. He watched as Charlotte turned slightly, her profile coming into view, her expression unreadable. He could see the soft lines that time had drawn across her face, but she still carried herself with the same quiet elegance. And then, their eyes met. For a moment, the world around them faded into insignificance. Charlotte's expression barely flickered. No surprise, no hesitation, just the barest flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. But she saw him, and she did not look away. William, his name on her lips after so many years sent a strange sensation through him. It wasn't warmth, nor was it anger. It was something more complex, something that felt dangerously close to regret. Charlotte. His voice was steady, calm, even as a storm built inside him. One of the young men stepped closer, subtly shifting his stance between William and Charlotte. Protective. Possessive. William's gaze snapped to him, studying his face, searching for answers where none were freely given. Before he could speak, Charlotte exhaled softly, tilting her head just slightly. "It's been a long time," she said, her voice composed but distant. His throat was dry, but he refused to let that show. "It has." A beat of silence. The four young adults were watching him carefully, as if measuring every move, every word. He forced a casual smile, though the tension in his chest was suffocating. "You look well." "And you look exactly the same," Charlotte responded, a trace of something, amusement, bitterness, hidden in her tone. He wanted answers. He wanted to demand explanations, to unravel the impossibility of what stood before him. But Charlotte was guarded, her posture unreadable. This was not a conversation for a crowded room, not with watchful eyes and calculating minds surrounding them. Instead, he leaned in slightly, keeping his voice low. "We should talk." For the first time, Charlotte hesitated, a flicker of something behind her gaze. But then, with a slow nod, she agreed. "Tomorrow." And just like that, she turned and walked away, the four young adults following without a word. William remained where he was, his heartbeat uneven, his thoughts spiraling into 1,000 unspoken possibilities. Tomorrow, he would have answers. Or, at the very least, the beginning of them. If you were in William's shoes, what would you do? Would you confront Charlotte immediately, or wait for more proof? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like this video, and subscribe to the channel to see how this shocking story unfolds. William sat in the back of his black Mercedes, his fingers drumming rhythmically against the leather armrest. The city blurred past the tinted windows, but his mind was far from the streets of Manhattan. It was back in a time he had long since buried. 19 years. A lifetime ago. And yet, one glance at Charlotte had been enough to bring it all rushing back. He exhaled sharply, tilting his head against the seat. What had she been doing all this time? Where had she gone? And those young adults, who were they? He needed answers, and tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The car pulled up in front of his penthouse building, the doorman greeting him with the usual deference, but William barely acknowledged him. His mind was too tangled, too fixated on a past that had resurfaced when he least expected it. He entered his home, a vast expanse of glass and steel overlooking the skyline, and poured himself a drink before sinking into the leather chair near the window. He stared out at the city, but all he could see was Charlotte. She had been his everything once. It had been years since he had allowed himself to remember that. They had met when they were young, before the money, before the name Becker carried weight in boardrooms and headlines. Charlotte had been unlike anyone else, grounded, fiercely intelligent, always challenging him in ways that no one else dared to. She saw through his ambition, past the charm, into something deeper, and he had loved her for it. Their marriage had been good in the beginning. She was his anchor, the one person who kept him from being consumed by the hunger for more. But then came the struggle, the years of trying, of failed treatments, of silent nights filled with unspoken grief. Charlotte had wanted a family more than anything, and William had wanted to give it to her. But it never happened. And slowly, the weight of that absence began to chip away at them. At first, it was the small things. The way she stopped reaching for his hand when they walked together. The way he buried himself in work, avoiding the quiet of their home. Then it became bigger. The arguments, the resentment. The way she looked at him with something he couldn't name. Something that felt like disappointment. And then, one day, she was gone. No drawn-out fights, no begging or pleading. Just a cold, legal document delivered to his office. And when he tried to reach her, she had already disappeared. She had left New York, left their life, left him. He told himself it was for the best, that it was easier this way. But even as the years passed, a part of him had never quite stopped looking for her, even if he never admitted it out loud. Now, after all this time, she had walked back into his world as if she had never left. And she hadn't been alone. William ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling under his skin. He needed to understand what he had seen tonight. Those young adults, there was no denying the resemblance. The sharp angles of their faces, the way one of them had the same piercing stare as his own father. It was more than a coincidence. But how? Charlotte had been infertile. He emptied the glass in a single swallow, the burn of the whiskey barely registering. There had to be an explanation. And tomorrow, he would get it. The night dragged on, sleepless and restless, his thoughts running in circles. By the time the first traces of dawn broke across the skyline, William had already showered, dressed, and was pacing his office. He had cleared his morning schedule, instructing his assistant to hold all calls. Today, nothing else mattered except finding out the truth. Charlotte had agreed to meet at a small cafe in Brooklyn, far from the high-end establishments William usually frequented. He arrived early, taking a seat near the window, his gaze flicking toward the entrance every few seconds. The place was quiet, unassuming. It didn't fit the life he had once shared with Charlotte, but maybe that was the point. When she walked in, he felt it again, that tightening in his chest, the pull of something old and unresolved. She looked the same and yet different. There was something in the way she carried herself now, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. She had always been strong, but this was something else. She sat across from him, folding her hands neatly on the table. "You look tired," she said, breaking the silence first. William huffed a short laugh, shaking his head. "Couldn't sleep. Too many questions." She met his gaze, unreadable as always. "I imagined so." He leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "Charlotte, don't play games with me. I saw them. Those kids, they're yours." She didn't flinch. Instead, she took a slow breath, her fingers tightening slightly around her coffee cup. "You always were direct," she murmured, almost to herself. Then, meeting his stare, she finally said, "Yes, they are." The words landed like a blow, even though he had already suspected it. William swallowed, his jaw tightening. "How?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "It's not something I can explain in a single conversation, William. It's complicated." He exhaled sharply, frustration evident. "Try me." For the first time, something flickered in her expression, something that looked like pain. "Do you really think I wanted to keep this from you?" William leaned back, crossing his arms. "I don't know what to think, Charlotte. I just know that you left, and now I find out you had 4 children after being told you couldn't." She shook her head slowly, looking down at her hands. "I didn't lie to you." That stung. "Then why?" His voice was quieter now, but no less demanding. She hesitated again, then said, "Because I didn't trust you." Silence. William felt the weight of those words settle between them. "I knew the man you were becoming," she continued. "You were consumed by your business, your ambitions. You barely saw me by the end. And if I had told you," she trailed off, shaking her head, "I couldn't risk it. I had to make a choice." William's throat tightened. "You took that choice from me." Charlotte met his gaze, steady and unyielding. "I did what I thought was right. You may hate me for it, but I won't apologize for protecting them." For the first time in years, William had no words. He only knew one thing. This wasn't over. Not even close. William's hands rested against the polished wood of the cafe table, his fingers curled just enough to keep his frustration at bay. He had spent the last 2 decades building an empire, maneuvering through ruthless boardroom battles, outsmarting rivals, and securing power with the precision of a man who had no room for error. And yet, here he was, sitting across from Charlotte, feeling as though he had already lost before the game had even begun. Her words still echoed in his mind. "I didn't trust you." He could have expected anger, even indifference, but that cut deeper than he cared to admit. William had always prided himself on control, on knowing the angles before stepping into any situation. But this was uncharted territory. Charlotte stirred her coffee slowly, her expression calm, but he could see it, the way her fingers trembled just slightly as she lifted the cup to her lips. This wasn't easy for her either. That should have given him some satisfaction, but it didn't. His voice was steady when he finally spoke, but the underlying edge was undeniable. "You expect me to sit here and just accept this? That you made the decision for me?" Charlotte sighed, setting her cup down gently. "I don't expect anything from you, William. Not anymore." He ignored the jab. "Who are they?" Her eyes flickered, and for the first time since they sat down, she hesitated. William leaned forward. "You've already admitted they're yours. But they're mine too, aren't they?" Charlotte exhaled slowly, her gaze locked onto his. "What difference would it make now?" His jaw tightened. "Don't do that. Don't act like I don't deserve an answer." A long silence stretched between them before she finally spoke. "Yes, William. They're yours." The air in his lungs vanished. He had known. Deep down, he had known. But hearing it spoken so plainly, so irrevocably, sent a rush of emotions through him that he wasn't prepared for. Anger, disbelief, a sharp, almost unbearable sense of loss. 19 years. 19 years of birthdays, milestones, laughter, and scraped knees. Moments that should have been his, stolen without his knowledge. His voice was lower now, strained. You took them from me. Charlotte's expression hardened. I saved them from you. That snapped something in him. His hands pressed flat against the table, his patience unraveling thread by thread. Do you even hear yourself? You saved them from their father. She met his anger with unwavering certainty. Yes. William let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Unbelievable. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. You have no idea what you've done, Charlotte. No idea what it feels like to know I had children out there, living entire lives without me. Charlotte's gaze softened, but she didn't apologize. And you have no idea what it was like raising them alone. No security, no guarantees, always looking over my shoulder, afraid one day you'd find out and try to take them away. William scoffed. You think I would have done that? She arched a brow. Wouldn't you? The truth hit him harder than he expected. If he had known, if she had told him back then, he wouldn't have been the man sitting across from her now. He had been ruthless, calculating, determined to dominate everything in his path. If Charlotte had come to him pregnant all those years ago, would he have put them first? Or would he have seen them as complications, as obstacles in his pursuit of success? She saw the realization flicker across his face, and something softened in her expression. That's why I never told you, William. I needed to be sure they'd grow up safe. Without conditions. Without being treated as part of your empire. His fingers curled into fists. They're my children. That makes them my responsibility. Charlotte shook her head. No, that makes them mine. I raised them. I was there for every scraped knee, every late-night fever, every fear, every triumph. I protected them. I loved them. I taught them to be good people. And I did it without you. The weight of those words settled into his bones. She wasn't just making a statement. She was drawing a line in the sand. He swallowed the frustration bubbling inside him, exhaling slowly. I need to meet them. Charlotte hesitated. I don't know if that's a good idea. William's gaze darkened. That's not your decision anymore. For the first time, she looked truly uncertain. He saw it in the way she chewed the inside of her cheek, in the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. It was one thing to have this confrontation in private, to control the narrative. But introducing him to them, that changed everything. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. I'm not asking for your permission, Charlotte. I'm their father. And whether you like it or not, I'm here now. She let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. Fine, but it'll be on my terms. William's jaw flexed, but he forced himself to stay calm. When Charlotte studied him for a long moment before answering. Tomorrow evening. My house. You'll meet them all at once, and we'll see how it goes from there. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He nodded, standing up slowly, his body thrumming with restless energy. I'll be there. Charlotte didn't say another word as he walked out of the cafe, but he felt her gaze on him until the door swung shut behind him. As he stepped onto the busy sidewalk, the realization settled over him like a weight he hadn't yet learned how to carry. Tomorrow, he would meet his children. Strangers. And yet, something told him they wouldn't feel like strangers at all. William had been in high-stakes negotiations, faced corporate betrayals, and maneuvered through some of the toughest business deals imaginable, but nothing had ever made his pulse race like this. He stood outside Charlotte's house, a modest yet elegant home tucked away in a quiet part of Brooklyn, a stark contrast to the penthouses and glass towers he was used to. He wasn't sure how long he had been standing there, staring at the front door, but it had been long enough for him to curse himself for this moment of hesitation. He had spent nearly 2 decades without these children in his life. Would they even want him there? Would they see him as nothing more than a ghost from a past they never knew? Charlotte had made it clear that tonight wasn't about him. It was about them. And for the first time in his life, William wasn't in control of how something would play out. The door opened before he even knocked. Charlotte stood there, arms crossed, her gaze unreadable. You came early, she said, tilting her head slightly. He forced a smirk. Old habits. She stepped aside, letting him in, and as he crossed the threshold, he felt like he was entering a world that should have been his all along, but had somehow remained out of reach. The living room was warm and inviting, filled with bookshelves, soft lighting, and framed photographs on the walls. He resisted the urge to scan them for pictures of his children. It was still surreal to think of them that way. He could hear voices coming from another room, laughter mixed with casual conversation. Then, suddenly, silence. They knew he was here. Charlotte led him to the dining room, where the 4 young adults were already seated. William's stomach clenched. They were all looking at him, each with a different expression. The eldest son, he was certain now, had an intensity in his gaze that mirrored William's own. The second son sat back slightly, his expression more neutral but no less aware. The 2 daughters, one with an analytical stare, the other with an unreadable smirk, seemed to be quietly assessing the situation. It was strange. He had expected to feel like an intruder, an outsider in their world, but instead, it felt like he was staring at pieces of himself scattered across the room. Charlotte cleared her throat. "This is William," she said simply. "I think you all know why he's here." The silence stretched until the eldest son finally leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "So what now?" William exhaled slowly, resisting the instinct to assert himself the way he would in a business meeting. He wasn't here to command the room. He was here to listen. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess that depends on you." The second son, lighter in demeanor but still sharp, arched a brow. "Depends on us? You're the one who just showed up after 19 years. William nodded, feeling the weight of the words hit him harder than he expected. "You're right, and I won't pretend that I deserve anything from you. But I need to be here, and I need to understand what I missed." The girl with the unreadable smirk leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "What exactly do you think you missed?" "Everything." William swallowed, glancing briefly at Charlotte before looking back at them. "Your entire lives." A beat of silence. "You're late," the eldest son said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't get to just walk in and ask for a place now." William didn't flinch. "I know. Then why are you here?" That was the question, wasn't it? He had asked himself the same thing 100 times. Was it guilt? A sense of obligation? The selfish need to fill a void he had never acknowledged until now? Maybe all of it. But looking at them now, he realized something else. "I don't want to be a stranger," he said, his voice quieter now. "I know I can't change the past, but I can try to be here now." Another long silence stretched between them, filled with unsaid words and hesitant emotions. Then, the second son, the one who had remained the most neutral, spoke. "Do you even know our names?" William stiffened. Charlotte inhaled sharply, and for the first time, he saw the flicker of regret in her eyes. She had never told him. He had never asked. William's throat tightened. "No," he admitted, "but I'd like to." The young man studied him for a moment before exhaling. "I'm Oliver. That's Leo." He gestured toward the eldest, who gave the barest nod. "That's Emily." He pointed toward the more observant of the 2 daughters. "And that's Sophie." William let the names settle in his mind, repeating them silently. Oliver, Leo, Emily, Sophie. They were more than strangers now. They were real. Leo, who had remained the most guarded, leaned back, watching him closely. "You want to know us? Fine. But don't expect us to make this easy." William met his stare, unwavering. "I wouldn't expect anything else." A small, almost imperceptible smirk ghosted over Leo's lips before it disappeared. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. It was something in between. Charlotte exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "Well," she said, glancing at her children, "I think that's enough for one night." William stood slowly. "Thank you for letting me be here." No one responded. But no one stopped him either. As he stepped outside into the cold night air, he realized something. For the first time since seeing Charlotte again, he felt something other than anger or confusion. He felt hope. William sat in his office, the dim city lights casting long shadows across the floor-to-ceiling windows. His desk, usually covered in neatly stacked documents, now had only one file sitting in the center. A file that had taken him less than a day to obtain. It had been too easy, just a few calls, a favor owed, and the details of Charlotte's life over the last 19 years were in front of him. He had debated whether or not to open it. He told himself he wanted to respect her privacy, that she would tell him what she wanted him to know in her own time, but the truth gnawed at him. The truth was, he couldn't stop himself. His fingers hovered over the manila folder before finally flipping it open. His breath caught as he scanned the first few pages. Hospital records, birth certificates, Dates. Names. A timeline of a life he had never been a part of. His eyes zeroed in on the line that mattered most. Father's name, unknown. The lie was there, in black and white. She had erased him from their history, cut him out so completely that even on an official document, he was nothing. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, trying to steady himself. He had expected this. And yet, seeing it written out made it real in a way he hadn't been prepared for. The past 24 hours had been a storm in his mind. Meeting them, Oliver, Leo, Emily, Sophie, had been nothing short of surreal. Every glance, every hesitant movement, every moment of silence between them had spoken volumes. They didn't trust him. They had no reason to. And now, seeing the way Charlotte had made sure he was nothing more than a shadow in their lives, he realized how much harder this was going to be. His thoughts drifted back to their dinner. The tension in the room had been thick, but beneath it, there had been something else. A crack in the wall they had built between themselves and him. Leo had been the hardest to read, his skepticism razor-sharp, but William had seen something in the way he watched him. Curiosity, maybe even something close to recognition. Oliver had been quieter, observing more than challenging. Emily had spoken the least, but her eyes had missed nothing, and Sophie, with her unreadable smirk, had been the wild card. None of them had given him an inch, but they hadn't shut him out completely either. And that, more than anything, gave him reason to keep going. He ran a hand down his face, exhaustion pulling at him, but sleep was the last thing on his mind. The real question that had been haunting him wasn't just why Charlotte had kept them from him. It was how. How had she had 4 children when they had been told she was infertile? He hadn't asked outright. He hadn't been ready for the answer. But the mystery was there, hanging between them, unanswered and unresolved. And William Becker was not a man who lived with unanswered questions. The next morning, he found himself outside Charlotte's house again, this time unannounced. He wasn't sure what he expected, but when she opened the door and saw him standing there, the exasperation in her eyes was immediate. "You really don't know how to wait, do you?" He let out a humorless chuckle. 19 years was a long enough wait, don't you think? She sighed but stepped aside, letting him in. The house smelled like coffee, warm and familiar, and for a brief moment, the memory of their old mornings together flickered through his mind. She had always been the one to wake first, moving through the house with quiet efficiency while he had lingered in bed, pretending to still be asleep just to hear the sounds of her morning routine. That life was long gone. "Coffee?" she asked, already moving toward the kitchen. He shook his head, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I'm not here for coffee, Charlotte." She didn't turn around, simply poured herself a cup and took a slow sip before finally looking at him. "Then what do you want?" He met her gaze, steady and unyielding. The truth. She didn't pretend not to understand. Her fingers tightened slightly around the mug, but her expression remained composed. "I told you what mattered." "No, you told me what you wanted me to hear," he corrected. "Now I need the rest." She exhaled, setting her cup down before folding her arms. "And if I don't tell you?" William stepped forward, his voice softer but no less firm. "Then I'll find out on my own." A flicker of something crossed her face. Anger, maybe, or resignation. She shook her head, as if he were exhausting. "Of course you would." "Charlotte," he pressed, his tone quieter now, almost careful. "How?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned against the counter, staring at something distant. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, lower, tinged with something he couldn't quite name. "After the divorce, I saw a specialist," she said. "A different one. I wasn't looking for hope, just closure. But they ran tests, and it turned out." She hesitated, then met his gaze. "I wasn't infertile, William." "Not entirely." His breath caught. "What?" "It was complicated," she continued, her voice controlled, but with an edge of emotion beneath it. "A rare condition, one that meant I could conceive, but the chances were impossibly low. We had tried, and we had failed, and I had believed it was over. But then," she exhaled slowly. "Then it happened." William's mind was spinning, trying to piece together the weight of what she was saying. "So you were pregnant when we divorced?" Charlotte hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking her head. "Not yet, but soon after." His stomach twisted. "And you never told me." "I already explained why," she said, her tone unreadable. "And before you say anything, I didn't do it to punish you. I did it to protect them." William let out a slow, shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. You should have told me, Charlotte. No matter what you thought of me back then, I deserve to know. She gave a sad sort of smile. Maybe, but you weren't the man standing in front of me now. You were someone else. He swallowed hard, knowing she was right. Silence settled between them, heavy and unspoken. William stared at the floor, at the space between them, at the time they had lost. He had come for the truth, and now that he had it, it didn't change what he had missed. Finally, he straightened. They deserved to know the full story. Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line. They deserved to make that decision for themselves. He met her gaze. Then let them. Another long silence. Then, after what felt like forever, she nodded. William exhaled. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was a start. William sat in his car outside Charlotte's house, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The truth she had revealed weighed on him in ways he hadn't expected. He had spent his life believing one version of the past, only to realize that he had been blind to the real story. Charlotte hadn't just walked away. She had made a choice that had rewritten both of their lives. He had spent years convincing himself that the past was nothing more than a closed chapter, but now, that chapter had reopened, and the ink was still wet. He wasn't a man prone to hesitation, but something about this moment made him pause. He had spent decades mastering the art of controlling every situation, yet this one refused to be controlled. The 4 young adults inside that house weren't numbers on a spreadsheet, weren't negotiable assets in a deal. They were his children, and he had no idea how to prove that he deserved even a fraction of their time. He exhaled sharply, shoving open the car door and stepping into the cool evening air. The street was quiet, the kind of place that felt worlds away from the corporate skyline he was used to. He had built a life in boardrooms and luxury suites, yet this small, quiet street was where his real life had been unfolding without him. When he knocked, Charlotte answered almost immediately, her expression unreadable. She studied him for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. The scent of something faintly familiar lingered in the air, coffee, a hint of vanilla, and something else, something that stirred old memories of a life he had let slip through his fingers. "They're in the living room," she said simply, closing the door behind him. He nodded, straightening his jacket, masking the anxiety creeping beneath his skin. When he entered the room, the 4 of them were already seated, their postures casual, but their eyes sharp with quiet evaluation. Leo, the eldest, leaned back against the couch, his arms crossed in a stance that could have been mistaken for disinterest, but William knew better. Oliver sat beside him, quieter but no less observant. Emily and Sophie were on the opposite couch, mirroring each other in ways that made William's stomach twist with the undeniable realization that they were all pieces of him and Charlotte, fragmented yet whole. No one spoke at first. William let the silence settle before finally breaking it. "I know this isn't easy for any of us," he said, keeping his voice even. "But I'm here because I need to be. Because I should have been here all along." Leo let out a short, dry laugh, shaking his head. "A little late for that, don't you think?" William met his stare, unflinching. "Yes, it is." That seemed to catch Leo off guard. His smirk faltered slightly, as if he had expected William to make excuses, to shift the blame, to offer the kind of empty apologies that meant nothing. Oliver was the first to speak after that, his tone measured. "So what exactly do you want from us?" William hesitated, not because he didn't have an answer, but because the weight of it pressed down on him more than he anticipated. He wasn't here to demand anything. He had no right to. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I don't expect anything. I don't expect you to forgive me, or to accept me into your lives overnight. But I want to know you, if you'll let me." The words hung in the air, heavier than he had intended. Emily, who had been mostly silent up until now, finally spoke. "You never looked for us," she said, her voice calm, but with an edge of something deeper. William exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know you existed." She tilted her head slightly. "And if you had?" He hesitated, knowing that his answer mattered more than he realized. "I would have found you." Sophie let out a soft scoff, shaking her head. "And then what? You would have raised us in some glass tower, molded us into little versions of yourself." William frowned, the accusation hitting harder than he expected. "That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" Leo pressed, his gaze unrelenting. "You're William Becker. You have money, power, a life that never included us. What's changed now? Everything. William leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. You're right about one thing. My life didn't include you. And that wasn't my choice, but it was my reality. Now, I have a choice. And I'm choosing to be here, even if it's too late. The silence stretched again, but this time, it felt different. Charlotte, who had remained near the doorway, finally spoke. No one is asking you to fix anything, William. That's not what this is about. He turned to her, nodding. I know, but that doesn't mean I won't try. Oliver sighed, rubbing his temple. This is the lot. William gave a small nod. I know. Emily looked at him closely, her gaze softer than Leo's, but just as piercing. And what happens if we let you in? What if you change your mind? William met her gaze. I won't. Sophie studied him, then exchanged a glance with Oliver. We're not making any promises. He allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Neither am I. But I'm not walking away from this. Leo exhaled sharply but nodded, almost begrudgingly. We'll see. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't even close. But it wasn't a no. And for William Becker, that was enough to keep going. William hadn't expected things to change overnight, but he also hadn't been prepared for the heavy silence that followed his conversation with his children. They had given him no clear answer, no indication of whether they wanted him in their lives, or if this was just a temporary curiosity on their part. The uncertainty gnawed at him. He was a man accustomed to results, to knowing where he stood in any given situation. But here, in the one place it mattered most, he had no control. Days passed with no contact. No calls. No messages. He had left that evening with a glimmer of hope, but now he wondered if it had been nothing more than wishful thinking. Every hour that ticked by felt like a widening chasm between him and the connection he desperately wanted to forge. He had always known that money could solve most problems, that influence could open doors. But what did you do when neither of those things mattered? What did you do when the people you wanted to reach had no interest in what you had to offer? He found himself pacing in his office late one evening, staring down at his phone, resisting the urge to call Charlotte. He wanted to ask if they had said anything, if they had asked about him, if they had even thought about him at all since that night. But he knew better than to push. They needed space. He just wasn't sure how much he could give before it drove him insane. Instead, he did what he did best. He searched for answers. It wasn't that he doubted Charlotte, but something about this situation didn't sit right with him. 19 years. For children, he had been erased so completely, as if he had never existed in their lives. And yet, when he looked at them, he saw pieces of himself staring back at him. He had believed Charlotte's story, had accepted that she had been told she was infertile only to later discover she wasn't. But some part of him, the part that had built his empire on asking the hard questions, couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something missing. And so, he made a decision. The DNA tests were easy to arrange. Discreet, efficient, with no chance of error. He had collected his own sample that night after leaving their house, and as much as he hated to admit it, he had used subtle means to acquire theirs. A glass left behind, a stray strand of hair, nothing invasive, nothing they would even notice. It wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about proving something to himself. And when the results came in, William felt his world tilt on its axis. There was no question, no doubt. They were his. His breath caught as he scanned the report, each name listed with an indisputable genetic match to him. The results didn't lie, but then his eyes caught something else, something he hadn't expected. The genetic markers showed something unusual, something that made his stomach tighten. He wasn't a scientist, but he understood enough to know that something wasn't adding up. The DNA was his, yes, but there were anomalies, indicators that suggested something different about the way they had been conceived. William's fingers tightened around the edge of the report. What the hell had Charlotte done? He needed answers. And this time, he wasn't going to wait for her to decide when to give them. Charlotte opened the door with a sigh, as if she had already known he was coming. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, her expression guarded. I had a feeling I'd be seeing you sooner rather than later. He held up the envelope. We need to talk. She studied him for a moment before stepping aside, letting him in. The living room was dimly lit, a book left open on the coffee table, the remnants of tea cooling in a ceramic mug. She had been relaxing before he arrived, and he wondered if she ever truly had peace, or if she had been waiting for this confrontation since the moment he reappeared in her life. She sat down on the couch, gesturing for him to do the same, but he remained standing. He wasn't in the mood to pretend this was a casual conversation. "You ran a test," she said, not asking, just knowing. William exhaled sharply. "Of course I did." Her lips pressed together. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised." "You shouldn't," he agreed. Then, after a pause, he dropped the envelope onto the table in front of her. "They're mine." She didn't react, didn't even look at the papers. "I never said they weren't." His jaw clenched. "No, you didn't. But you also didn't tell me the whole truth, did you?" Now, finally, he saw something flicker across her face. The slightest hesitation. And that was all the confirmation he needed. "What did you do, Charlotte?" She inhaled slowly, as if bracing herself. "I told you, after the divorce, I learned I wasn't completely infertile. But that wasn't the full story." William's pulse pounded. "Then tell me the full story." She met his gaze, something unreadable in her expression. "I was desperate, William. After everything, after years of believing I'd never have children, I was given a second chance. And I took it." His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. "How?" She hesitated for a long moment before finally answering. "I went through a medical trial." William stiffened. "A trial?" Charlotte nodded. "It was experimental. A fertility treatment that was still in its early stages. They told me the odds were slim, that it might not work, but I didn't care. I had already lost you. I had already lost everything we had built together. But I wasn't going to lose the chance to have a family." His mind was spinning. "And you didn't think I should have known about this?" Her voice was quieter now. "Would you have supported it, William? Back then, would you have been the kind of man who would have stood by me through something like that? Or would you have seen it as another inconvenience, another thing standing in the way of your success?" The truth was, he didn't know. He let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "And the anomalies?" She swallowed, finally looking at the papers. The treatment wasn't just about increasing the chances of conception. It was about ensuring viability, reducing risk factors. The doctors made genetic modifications, nothing drastic, nothing unethical, but enough to improve their odds of survival. William felt a cold weight settle in his chest. So they weren't just naturally conceived. Charlotte shook her head. "No, but they're still ours, William. Nothing about this changes that." He wasn't sure what to say to that. He had walked in here looking for answers, but all he had found were more questions. Finally, he exhaled. "Do they know?" Charlotte's lips parted slightly, hesitation flashing across her face. "No, not everything." William nodded slowly, processing. Then, quietly, he said, "They deserve to." She met his gaze, and for the first time that night, he saw the weight of 19 years pressing down on her. "I know." Neither of them spoke for a long time. But for the first time since re-entering her life, William realized that Charlotte wasn't his enemy. She had simply been trying to survive. And now, together, they had to decide how much of the past their children deserved to know. William sat in his car long after leaving Charlotte's house, his grip tightening around the steering wheel as the weight of what he had just learned settled deep into his bones. He had walked in demanding answers, expecting resistance, but instead, he had uncovered something that he never could have imagined. His children, his 4 children, hadn't just been conceived against all odds. They had been part of an experiment, a medical trial that had altered their very existence before they had even been born. And Charlotte had gone through it alone. The thought of it made his stomach tighten with something he couldn't quite name. Anger? Guilt? A deep, consuming sense of loss for all the years he had missed? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that everything he thought he understood about the past had been rewritten in a matter of minutes. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. He had a choice now. He could let this consume him, let it fuel his resentment toward Charlotte for keeping him in the dark, or he could do something about it. He wasn't the same man he had been 19 years ago, and for the first time in a long time, he realized that maybe that was a good thing. With a steadying breath, he reached for his phone. He didn't have all the pieces yet, but there was someone who might. "Dr. Whitmore," he said as soon as the call connected. The voice on the other end was calm but cautious. "William, it's been a while." "Not long enough," he muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I need information." There was a pause, then a quiet sigh. "I had a feeling this call was coming." William's jaw tightened. "So you knew?" "I knew there was a file out there with your name on it," Dr. Whitmore admitted. "But I didn't know if you'd ever see it." William swallowed the frustration rising in his chest. I need to know everything about that trial. Every detail. No omissions. Another pause. Then, finally, come to my office tomorrow morning. We'll talk. William ended the call and stared out at the city, the distant hum of traffic barely registering. He had spent his entire career chasing answers, solving problems, staying one step ahead of the world. But this was the one thing he had never seen coming. When he arrived at Dr. Whitmore's office the next morning, the older man was already waiting, sitting behind his desk with an expression that carried the weight of knowledge William wasn't sure he was ready to hear. You understand that what I'm about to tell you was never meant to be public knowledge, Whitmore said as he slid a thick file across the desk. William picked it up, but didn't open it yet. He met Whitmore's gaze, his voice firm. Tell me anyway. The doctor leaned back in his chair. The trial was called Project Genesis. It was designed for women who had been told they were infertile, but who still had a slim chance of conception under the right conditions. The goal was to enhance the probability of a viable pregnancy without compromising the mother's health. But the real breakthrough came in how we modified the embryos before implantation. William's fingers tightened around the file. Modified how? Whitmore hesitated. We made genetic adjustments. Nothing drastic. No changes to appearance, intelligence, or personality, but we optimized the embryos for resilience. We enhanced their immune responses, reduced genetic predispositions to disease. It was groundbreaking, and Charlotte was one of the first successful cases. William felt the weight of those words press against his chest. You mean to tell me that my children were designed? Not designed, Whitmore corrected gently. Optimized. They are still your children, still biologically yours and Charlotte's. The modifications simply gave them a better chance at survival. William exhaled, staring at the file in his hands. The implications of this were staggering. His children weren't just ordinary. They were the result of scientific intervention. And they had no idea. He looked back at Whitmore. Does Charlotte know all of this? She knows what she needed to know, Whitmore said carefully. She wasn't given access to all the details. She only knew that the treatment increased her chances of carrying to term. She was never told about the genetic enhancements. William's pulse pounded in his ears. Charlotte had believed she was simply undergoing an experimental fertility treatment, but in reality, she had unknowingly participated in something far more complex. He wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. What happens now? He asked, his voice quieter than before. Whitmore studied him for a long moment before answering. That's up to you. William left the office with more questions than answers. That night, he found himself back at Charlotte's house. This time, when she opened the door and saw the look on his face, she didn't question why he was there. She simply stepped aside, letting him in. They sat in the dimly lit living room, the air between them heavy with the weight of unspoken things. William set the file on the table between them, but Charlotte didn't reach for it. Instead, she sighed. You found something, didn't you? He nodded. Did you know? She shook her head slowly. Know what? That the treatment wasn't just about helping you conceive. That they altered things. Charlotte's breath hitched. What are you talking about? William leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Project Genesis wasn't just about giving you a chance at pregnancy. It was about optimizing the embryos. Our children weren't just conceived. They were engineered to be stronger, healthier. They were part of something bigger than we ever realized. Her face paled, her hands trembling slightly as she processed his words. No, she whispered. That's not. I didn't. She trailed off, shaking her head. I thought it was just a trial, just a new way to help women like me. I never questioned it. William exhaled. You weren't given the full story. None of us were. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Charlotte looked up, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. What do we do? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. All he knew was that their children deserved to know the truth. And no matter how complicated that truth was, they had to be the ones to decide what it meant for them. William had spent his entire life believing that control was the key to success. He had built his empire by anticipating problems before they arose, by staying 3 moves ahead of everyone else. And yet, for the first time, he felt as though he had no control at all. The truth sat between him and Charlotte like a living thing, impossible to ignore, impossible to contain. She hadn't known. That much was clear. The shock on her face, the way her hands trembled as she clutched the file he had brought, told him that whatever sins she had committed, this wasn't one of them. But that didn't change the fact that their children had been part of something far greater than either of them had understood at the time. They weren't just his and Charlotte's. They belonged to something bigger, a scientific experiment, a medical anomaly that neither of them had consented to. William watched as Charlotte flipped through the pages, her eyes darting over the medical jargon, the test results, the clinical notes from doctors who had never seen them as people, only as case studies. She swallowed hard, shutting the file with a sharp breath before looking up at him. They don't know. He nodded. No, but they should. Charlotte's jaw tightened. And what do you think that will do to them, William? They're already struggling with the idea of you being in their lives. Now we're supposed to tell them that they weren't normal? William clenched his fists, not because he disagreed, but because he understood exactly what she meant. He had spent his life being admired for his strength, his ambition, his ability to withstand pressure without breaking. But his children had never asked to be different. They had never known that they were part of something greater than themselves. And now, the moment they finally started to let him in, he was supposed to shatter their reality? He exhaled slowly, his voice steady. They have a right to the truth, Charlotte. It's not our decision to make. It never should have been. Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line. And if they hate us for it? William let the question settle in the air between them. He knew the risk. He had already spent 19 years as a stranger to them. There was every possibility that this revelation would push them further away, that they would see it as yet another betrayal rather than the final piece of the puzzle. But wasn't that the cost of honesty? Finally, he met her gaze. Then we live with it. Charlotte stared at him for a long moment before finally nodding. The conversation with their children was set for the following evening. William had expected the tension, had braced himself for the inevitable storm, but nothing could have prepared him for the weight of the moment when they all sat down in Charlotte's living room, waiting for answers they didn't yet know they needed. Leo, as expected, took the lead. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his sharp eyes locked onto William's. You said you wanted to be honest with us. So start talking. William glanced at Charlotte, but she gave him no sign of whether she wanted to speak first. Instead, he exhaled and faced them. There's something you need to know. Something we didn't understand ourselves until recently. Oliver frowned slightly, exchanging a glance with Emily. What does that mean? William hesitated only for a second before continuing. You weren't conceived the way most children are. Silence. Then Sophie laughed, short, almost disbelieving. Wow, that's definitely not what I was expecting. William didn't smile. Charlotte was told she was infertile. After our divorce, she sought out a medical trial, one designed to give women like her another chance at having children. She didn't know at the time, but the treatment was experimental. Emily's eyes narrowed. Define experimental. William met her gaze. Your DNA was altered before you were born. The room fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. Leo was the first to react. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room before turning back to face them. You're saying we were genetically modified? His voice was sharp, but beneath it, there was something else. Something raw. Charlotte spoke then, her voice softer than William's. Not in the way you're thinking. They didn't change who you are. They made sure you were stronger, that you wouldn't have the same genetic predispositions to diseases, that your bodies would be resilient. It wasn't about making you different. It was about giving you a better chance. Sophie scoffed. A better chance? And what if we didn't want it? Charlotte flinched, but she didn't back down. You were babies. We didn't know what we didn't know. I thought I was just getting help to conceive. I had no idea there was more to it. Oliver, who had remained quiet up until now, finally spoke. So let me get this straight. You're saying we weren't just born, we were designed. William exhaled. No, you were born exactly as you were meant to be. But science made sure you had the best odds possible. Leo let out a harsh breath, running a hand through his hair. And you think this is just something we're supposed to accept? Like, oh, by the way, kids, you were part of a secret experiment, but no big deal? William's jaw clenched. I think you deserve the truth. And what if we didn't want it? Leo's voice rose now, sharp and unforgiving. What if we were happy just thinking we were normal? William forced himself to stay calm. Would you rather have never known? Leo scoffed, but didn't answer. Emily, who had been quiet for the longest, finally spoke, her voice softer but no less cutting. What happens now? William hesitated before answering. That's up to you. Sophie shook her head, standing up. I need air. She walked out, the door clicking shut behind her. Oliver rubbed his face, sighing. I don't even know what to do with this. Charlotte looked at her children, her eyes filled with the kind of pain only a mother could understand. You don't have to do anything. You just have to know. Leo's gaze flickered to William again, his expression unreadable. You kept this from us. For 19 years. William met his stare without wavering. Because we didn't know ourselves. And that's why we're telling you now. Leo didn't respond. Instead, he walked out, following Sophie. Oliver stayed a moment longer before muttering something under his breath and disappearing into the hallway. Only Emily remained, her expression pensive. She watched William and Charlotte carefully before standing. I don't know if I can forgive you, she admitted quietly. But I think I understand why you told us. Then she was gone, leaving William and Charlotte sitting in the wreckage of the truth. Charlotte exhaled shakily. We might have just lost them. William stared at the empty room, his hands curling into fists. Then we fight to get them back. And for the first time in his life, he knew this was a fight he couldn't afford to lose. William sat in his office, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey on his desk, the amber liquid catching the dim light from the city skyline beyond the window. It had been 3 days since he and Charlotte had told the children the truth. 3 days of silence. No calls, no texts, no signs that any of them wanted to see him again. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the emptiness that followed had settled in his chest like a weight that refused to lift. He had faced losses before. Deals gone wrong, partnerships broken, betrayals in business that had cost him millions. He had built a life on risk, on strategy, on knowing how to recover no matter how hard the fall. But this was a loss he didn't know how to fix. His fingers drummed against the glass, his mind racing. He had told himself that coming back into their lives meant being honest, that they deserved the truth no matter how difficult it was to hear. But what if all he had done was prove to them that he was a mistake waiting to happen? His phone vibrated against the desk. He grabbed it without thinking, his pulse spiking when he saw the name on the screen. Emily. He hesitated before answering, steadying himself. Emily. There was a pause on the other end before she spoke, her voice measured but careful. We need to talk. William straightened in his chair. Name the time and place. Here. Tonight. He didn't hesitate. I'll be there. The line went dead, and for the first time in 3 days, something inside him shifted. By the time he pulled up in front of Charlotte's house, it was already dark. He stepped out of the car, smoothing the tension from his face, preparing himself for whatever was waiting for him inside. The last time he had been here, he had left with the feeling that he might never be allowed back. Now, he was about to find out if that was true. Charlotte opened the door before he even knocked. She looked tired, as if the past few days had been as hard on her as they had been on him. She didn't say anything, just stepped aside to let him in. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Oliver sat on the couch, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Leo leaned against the wall, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against his arm as if he were waiting for an excuse to walk out. Sophie sat with her legs curled beneath her, expression blank, while Emily stood near the fireplace, watching William carefully. No one spoke right away. Finally, William cleared his throat. I wasn't sure if I'd hear from you. Emily crossed her arms. We needed time. He nodded, waiting. Leo exhaled sharply. We're not going to pretend like what you told us wasn't messed up. Because it was. And honestly, I still don't know how I feel about it. Sophie huffed. I know how I feel about it. I hate it. William's stomach tightened, but he kept his voice calm. I get that. Do you? Oliver asked, his gaze sharp. Because I don't think you do. You've had time to process this. You've had years of living your life however you wanted, never even knowing we existed. And now you just drop this on us and expect us to what? Just deal with it. William exhaled slowly. No, I don't expect anything from you. Emily studied him for a long moment before speaking again. You say that, but you do expect something. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. He met her gaze. I expect a chance. That's it. Silence stretched between them. Leo scoffed, running a hand down his face. And if we say no? William nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Then I leave. Charlotte tensed beside him. William continued, his voice steady. I'm not here to force myself into your lives. I can't undo the past. I can't take back the years I missed, and I can't change the fact that you were kept from me. But I can be here now. And if you don't want that, If you decide that this is too much, that it's better if I walk away, I'll do it. No questions asked. The words felt heavier than he expected, but he meant them. Emily exhaled slowly. And what if we say yes? Something inside him steadied. Then I stay, and I prove to you that I'm worth knowing. Leo let out a harsh breath, shaking his head. It's not that simple. I know, William said quietly. Sophie sat forward, her eyes sharp. You want a chance? Fine. Prove that you actually give a damn. Not with money, not with promises. With actions. William nodded, his jaw tightening. Tell me what you need from me. Another silence, but this time, it felt different. The hostility was still there, but beneath it, there was something else, possibility. Leo was the first to move. He pushed off the wall, shoving his hands into his pockets before looking at William. We'll see, he said simply. William knew what that meant. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. Emily nodded slightly. We'll see. Oliver rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling. Yeah, I guess we will. Sophie hesitated the longest, her expression unreadable, but eventually, she stood and shrugged. Fine. We'll see. William let out a slow breath. It wasn't a victory, but it was something. Charlotte gave him a look, something soft and knowing, as if she had expected this outcome before he had. As William walked to the door, Leo spoke again. One condition. William turned back. Anything. Leo's expression darkened slightly. No more secrets. William nodded. No more secrets. And for the first time in his life, he meant it.